Ian, welcome to GialloFestival. We talk about your novels, John Rebus, of course, and then of Tartan Noir. So, you write novels, you sing in a band named Best Picture, you are a full-time novelist. Your latest book, novel, published in Italy, La Casa delle Bugie in a House of Lies, edited by Rizzoli. Now to the question. So, you are said to be a leading exponent of Tartan Noir. So, apart from being Scottish, what are the characteristics of this crime fiction, if there are some?
It's a good question. A lot of Scottish crime writers that I know were influenced not so much by the classic English tradition, the Agatha Christie school of crime fiction. They were more influenced by Hollywood movies and TV cop shows, but also by a reading of Scottish literature. And my first crime novel was written to be a contemporary response to Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And if you look at the history of Scottish literature, there is a theme running through it of the doppelganger, of the divided self, the fact that we human beings are capable of being good, but also capable of being evil. And so that Jekyll and Hyde narrative runs through a lot of Scottish crime fiction. And Edinburgh, the city that I'm talking to you from, is very much a Jekyll and Hyde city. When the visitor arrives, the tourist arrives, they see the castle, the monuments, they hear the bagpipes, they see the culture and the traditions. But just below the surface is a contemporary city with contemporary problems. And crime fiction allows me to write about those problems.
So, John Rebus, the main character, right now, 22 books, maybe 30-year history. How do you do? Is he who suggests you the stories, or, that's basically a life together. So you make John Rebus getting older and older. Why this choice?
Well, when I invented John Rebus, I was 24 and he was 40. He wasn't like me at all. He was very different in his nature to me. And he was meant to only exist for one book. But I found him a really interesting character. And my editor, after I had finished the first Rebus novel, I then wrote a spy novel and a thriller. And my editor then said, whatever happened to that guy Rebus? I liked him. And I said, yeah, I liked him too. And the thing about a detective is the character of the detective allows me access to society from the very top to the very bottom. So I thought, if I want to write, if my theme is going to be society and the problems we have in contemporary society, a detective is a good way to explore that society. So he stuck around, and I made the decision that he would live in real time. So every book would be 1 year of his life. And that is a problem. So some years ago now, I wrote a book called Exit Music, which was intended to be the final Rebus novel, because he had reached 60, and at age 60 in Scotland, as a cop, as a detective, you are made to retire. But he just refused to go. So I found other things to do with him, working as a civilian for the police, and becoming involved in old unsolved cases, because being a detective is part of his DNA. It's the thing that gives his life meaning, so he cannot give it up. Although he is no longer a professional detective, he cannot give it up. And as to your question of where the stories come from, usually it starts with a theme, something I want to explore, and then I find a plot, a story that allows me to explore that theme, to ask some big questions about morality or culture or society. And then I ask myself, which character do I need? And mostly the answer to that has been Rebus. Not always, but mostly. So he's just always been the best means for me to write the kinds of books I want to write.
So what happens, if we can say it, in the last book to John Rebus? He has retired, but he's involved in a cold case, an investigation on a cold case. And what happened? Don't say too much, because you know.
No, I won't say too much. You know, I cannot say too much because I don't remember very much. The book was written 2 years ago, and already since then I've written 2 more books. So it's difficult for me to remember my plots. Once the story is done, it's done. Yes, no, it's. I wanted to go back to Rebus's early life as a detective. I wanted to look at what had formed him, what experiences in the police had made him the kind of detective that he became. And also the culture in the police that used to exist and still does exist of covering up the crimes and the mistakes made by your fellow officers. I wanted to look at that culture. The police are very much a law unto themselves. They lie and they cheat and they cover up for crimes that they've committed. That isn't as prevalent now as it would have been in the 1970s and 80s. So I've got a missing persons case, a private investigator who went missing, and his body is found in some woods in the trunk of his car, the boot of his car, by some kids. When I wrote the first few pages of that story, the kids who find the body were going to play a large role in the book. But the book said, no, we don't really need them. Their role now is finished, and let's move on to the police. But when I got the idea for the book, there was the possibility the novel could be a novel about these kids. But when they found the body, one of them picks up his mobile phone and phones the police. At that point, it ceases to be their story and it becomes someone else's story. And then Rebus becomes involved.
So in your book, you tell us the relation between policemen. So how do you know these things in such detail? And do you have some friends who are cops?
When I wrote the first Inspector Rebus novel, I was a student studying literature at the University of Edinburgh. I didn't know anything about the police. I wrote to the chief of police and I said, will you help me? And I went to a police station to interview 2 detectives. But because the plot of my first book, Noughts and Crosses, was very similar to a real life case, I became a suspect in that case. So I learned a valuable lesson, which is don't go near the police. Do not go near the police, because you might become a suspect in a murder inquiry. So for a long time I didn't. I just made it up. I just invented. I thought, what might it be like to be a police officer? And I had read some crime fiction, of course. But then police officers became fans of the books. And one in particular, a detective, said, Ian, you make a few mistakes. Can I explain to you why you make these mistakes? And he still is a good friend of mine. He's now retired. But he was very influential. He would take me to police stations. He would introduce me to other detectives. He would show me murder case notes. He would introduce me to pathologists and lawyers. He was a good friend. Now, because I'm so much older, all my police contacts are retired. So when I go to the pub in Edinburgh, I sometimes go with some retired detectives or cops. And they talk about the old days. They talk about the past. And that's good. I mean, because, you know, that is the stage that Rebus is at now in his career. He's now the kind of retired cop who would go to the pub and reminisce about the way things used to be. And that's partly what the latest book is about, is that notion. Was policing in the past better, worse, or just different?
Okay. So now we are going to the questions about the DTEC team, about DTEC project. That's an European project for understanding people, promoting the European public and cultural space. And they want to know from you, how do you think crime fiction has critically, realistically reflected on social and political issues concerning the Scottish society and more generally the European society?
It's a complicated question,
I know.
because crime fiction can confront social issues, but crime fiction can also be an escape from social issues. It's escapism. It's a kind of fantasy literature in which the good guys usually win. Problems are usually solved, murderers are almost always captured and prosecuted, and order is restored to society. And that is a fiction, that is a fantasy. In my novels, I want to have the freedom to write about cops who break the rules, who don't always get the correct result. Justice isn't always done. But what I think attracted me to the crime novel as a writer, and I think is also the reason so many young writers are turning to crime fiction, is because you can do pretty much everything in the crime novel. It's got a great sense of place. You've got very strong characters. You can talk about a culture, a society from the very top to the very bottom. You can talk about corruption in politics, in finance, in business. You can also talk about the fact that the capitalist system that we have created means that as well as winners, there are losers. So you can talk about the people at the very bottom of society, the people who have nothing and therefore are driven to commit crime or are forced into committing crime because they have no option, no alternative. So all of that can be contained in the crime novel. If I'm visiting any country in the world, I'll try and read the crime fiction that's set there before I go, because it's almost like a travel guide to that country, its politics, its people, what the culture is like, places to go, places not to go, what the food is like sometimes, where the good bars are. You can get all of that from crime fiction, but also you get very big moral questions that are being posed to you as a reader. And I think that's what's attractive. I think young writers are coming to crime fiction now, not seeing it as an escapist form, as just an entertainment, a book to be read on the train or the plane and then discarded, but it's something that actually asks big moral questions of us. And maybe crime fiction always has done. But when I began to read crime fiction, my sister, who's a little bit older than me, she was a big fan of Agatha Christie. And when I was 11 or 12, I tried Agatha Christie and I just didn't like them. It was a world I didn't understand. It was a world that didn't seem to be close to the world I lived in. It was a very different kind of society. And the books that attracted me early on were the American crime novels, more urban, darker, grittier, more violent, but also where order isn't always restored. At the end of the American noir novel, the baddies may get away with it. The good guys may not win. And I really thought that was an interesting perspective.
Do you think of yourself as you are as an European writer? If yes, what does this entail for your work?
I mean, from an early age, I've tried to read everything I can, novels from different cultures, from the American novel to European novels. For a long time, it wasn't easy in the United Kingdom because translation wasn't always available. So, for example, Italian crime fiction, pretty much until Umberto Eco came along, or maybe Sciascia, you could get. But when I was a student, I was reading Italo Calvino. I was reading a lot of European literature, Milan Kundera. I was very interested in nouveau roman. I did a doctoral thesis in the novels of Muriel Spark. You can possibly see a picture of her behind me on the wall. She's my favourite writer. Muriel Spark, buried in Italy, buried in a cemetery near Arezzo. She was very European. And a lot of Scottish writers were writers of the world. Robert Louis Stevenson left Scotland, Muriel Spark left Scotland. Many Scottish writers have left and gone out into the world to explore. And Spark was influenced by the nouveau roman. And so she led me into the novels of Alain Robbe-Grillet and to other literary novelists who used crime fiction. Umberto Eco did it brilliantly. You know, literary novelists who used the structure of the crime novel, the whodunit, the mystery novel, the giallo, to tell us something about the world. And so for me, it was never that crime fiction was a lesser form of literature. For me, crime fiction was always literature. And Muriel Spark herself has written one of the great crime novels, The Driver's Seat, which is probably set in Italy, although the country is never specified. But it's probably Italy. Certainly when it was filmed in Italy. And it's a fantastic crime novel that turns the crime novel on its head. It's a victim looking for a murderer.
Yes, that's true. So do you think there is something specific about European crime fiction opposed to the American one? And if there is a peculiar European approach to crime fiction, something as Euro Noir, sorry.
It's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to look at a French novelist and say they're doing the same thing as a Spanish or an Italian novelist. I mean, they're all working in their own cultures. But the crime novel, usually at its heart, there is the same question being asked, never mind which country you're writing in, which language you're writing in. The question is, why do we human beings keep doing terrible things to each other? Throughout history, why? What is it about us as human beings that means that some of us commit crime, commit murder? Is it to do with society? Is it to do with the structures that we have set up, the political system? Is it the fact that we are animals and we are only one step away from the cave? From prehistoric times, we've come very few steps from the cave. And we see that in European history a lot. Now, what European crime fiction has is a history of European bloodshed, major wars, major conflicts. And so that, I think, the sensibility that comes from that, I think, is there in European crime fiction. Certainly, it's difficult just now with Brexit. It's difficult for someone in the United Kingdom to look at Europe and say we are part of Europe. But as a Scot, as someone who lives in Scotland and is Scottish by birth and by nature, the Scots have always felt close ties to Europe. And that still is true. And a lot of people in the creative arts, the creative industry in the UK are just heartbroken that Brexit is happening. Because we feel these very close ties to writers and readers across the globe. And I mean, usually if it wasn't for COVID, I would spend a large part of my year traveling, going to festivals, going to bookshops, meeting readers in all different cultures, all different cities and countries. And that gives you a fantastic breadth of experience. And we're losing that. We're becoming very insular. And I think it's problematic that Brexit is happening at the same time as COVID, because what COVID is telling all our different cultures is put up barriers. You need to put up barriers between you and the people in the next state, the people in the next country, the people in the next city. So we're becoming very isolationist. And this, the internet, is allowing us to become much more isolationist, I'm afraid. And it will never replace human contact. It will never replace human interaction. But it's a very dangerous time. And just to add on to that very briefly, if you write crime fiction specifically that involves detectives or involves cops, difficult questions are being asked just now of you as an author. because people, because they see it on their screens, now know that the police are part of the problem or can be part of the problem. And if you are writing about cops as the good guys, as the people who bring order to society, and then you look at your TV screen, you look at the news, and you see protesters being battered everywhere from Hong Kong to the United States of America, and you see police complicit in this and carrying out the instructions of the state, you go, my God, how can these be the good guys? How can these be the heroes of my stories? So that, I think, is going to change what crime writers like me do in the future.
Okay. And how did the European crime fiction influence your own work, and which are the European writers that have inspired you most, if there are some? You told me about...
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken of a few writers already, and I'm very bad at remembering names. I mean, there are modern Italian crime writers whose works I have read, but again, not all of it is translated. And I'm just going to forget names because I'm terrible. And it's been a couple of years since I was in Italy and met some of them. But recently, because of the
not only Italy. I mean,
no. But I was just about to move on. But just recently, I've been reading the Maigret novels and the novels of Georges Simenon, and I've been struck by how modern Simenon seems. And in fact, his Maigret novels were not my favourites. The ones I liked were what are called his roman dur, hard, tough novels, of kind of very venal people, people with no moral code, some of whom seem to be getting away with murder until guilt overwhelms them. And so I've really enjoyed reading its new translations from the French to English. Some new translations have just been published. I've enjoyed those a lot. And a lot of the writers I used to love Italo Calvino when I was young. That idea of playing games, using fiction as a way of playing games. There was a journal, when I was a student, I wrote an essay and submitted it to a journal of Italian literary studies. And it was published. And it was an essay about If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, which is still one of my favourite books because it's a book about a love of reading. It's a book about how reading is a form of escape, is the perfect form of escape, but is also a way of looking at the world, and gives you and leads you down paths that mean you can take a journey through the world, the real world, as well as the fictional world. So I've always been a huge fan of Italo Calvino. And Germany, I mean, there's some German writers I've read, but again, the problem is finding these books in translation. At the moment in the UK, the trend is for Scandinavian crime fiction. We're always being told that these Scandinavian writers are the best, but I know publishers are looking for the next culture. They're looking for the next big thing, and so they're looking further afield in Scandinavia. And one thing I'm not so keen on with the Scandinavian crime fiction is that it is very heavily influenced by Hollywood. It feels very driven, like a kind of widescreen action movie a lot of the time. And so some of the action, some of the plots are not believable. They're there for effect. I much prefer a nuanced psychological crime fiction. And I find that in many cultures, but not necessarily in Scandinavia.
Yeah. So, A Sound for the Dark Times is the last book, but your last book, but not yet translated into Italian. And do you know when we will be able to read it in Italian?
No, I don't. I don't know when you'll be able to read A Song for the Dark Times in Italian. It depends on the translator. How long is the translator going to take to translate it? I'm sure they're working on it right now. I would imagine it'll be within the next year. Obviously, within the next year. Usually my Italian books in translation are released about a year after they're published in English. It's been getting great reviews. People have been saying it's one of the best, if not the best, Rebus novel. It's quite an elegiac novel. Rebus's daughter, her partner has gone missing, and she lives way up in the far north of Scotland, far from civilization. And I want to take Rebus to a place where he has no safety net, where he's out of his comfort zone. So he travels to the very far north of Scotland to try and help her. But the big moral question is is he going there as a parent, as a father, or is he going there as a detective? So when he arrives, if he thinks that she has had something to do with the disappearance of her partner, will he try and protect her by framing someone else for the crime? Or will he try and prove her guilt and put her in jail? So that's the big moral question that is at the core of the book. But also it looks back to, I mean, the reason it's called A Song for the Dark Times, I got that title in September last year, September 2019, when I thought Europe and the world were in a pretty dark place. We had the rise of the far right, with a polarization of political views. There were camps, you had to be yes or no, good or bad. It was Jekyll and Hyde, it was very binary, the choices we were being given. And we seem to be collapsing into the same mess we collapsed into in the 1930s. And meantime, we've got the world on fire, whether it's Australia or America, there were fires everywhere. We've got riots in the streets. It just seemed to me like a very dark time. And Brexit was happening, of course, my God. So that was the dark time that I was writing about. And the corollary for that is that I started getting interested in internment camps. At the start of World War II, the British would round up anybody who wasn't from their culture. If you were Italian, if you were the Italian guy who ran the ice cream shop or the fish and chip shop, you were put in prison. If you were German, if you were Chinese or Japanese, whatever, you were interned. And there were over 1,000 of these camps. Because we were being told not to trust these people, not to trust our neighbours. They've got a different surname. They look different. And so I thought, this is where we're heading again in the modern times. It's where we're heading towards a place where that could happen again. And so I use internment camps. Some of them still exist in Scotland as tourist attractions, as places you can go and learn the history. And so Rebus's daughter's partner, who has gone missing, has been investigating one particular internment camp in the north of Scotland. And Rebus wonders if his disappearance is linked to that.
So, Ian, our time is over. Thank you for being with us. I hope to see you soon, maybe at one or another festival. So, personally, stay healthy. That's the only thing I can say to you and to your family, because I think health is the most important thing we have. So thank you.
And
so
psychological
much.
health, psychological health.
Sure.
And reading books helps with that. So people keep reading books, because reading is a form of escape and it will help you through these dark times. And tanti grazie, mille grazie.
Grazie. Thank you so much.
Ciao. Ciao.
Ciao.